Hi, good morning. Supposedly we are starting. Okay, hi. Normally I do, when I do a graduate seminar, I take a 3-hour session once a week. So we have now covered what would normally be 2 weeks of a term. Today is week 3. At this point in time, you must be having some questions, some comments from your readings. There must be some things that you're finding confusing. I'm especially interested to know what you have questions about. What do you find confusing? If you are confused about anything, I think that's a good sign. Do not feel discouraged if you feel confused. Please do not feel discouraged if you feel confused. Confusion is part of the process of learning. It's nice to be reminded of that basic fact while you are feeling a bit confused. So can I just ask, from the last 2 days that we've spent together, what are you thinking about? Are there questions that you would like to see addressed based on what you've reviewed in your mind? What are your thoughts? I'd love a little bit of feedback from you, basically. No confusion? Everything's clear? No, it cannot be. Acha, okay, sorry. Okay.
I think there's just so much information.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, everyone has to speak into the mic for the recording.
To be official.
Yeah.
Okay. There's just so much information we've been inundated with, and very important information.
Yes.
I'm trying to place things in certain pigeonholes so that I can kind of remember where they belong.
Yes.
Looking for linear progression on things, and
Yeah.
it's not there.
No.
And that's kind of freaking me out. But it's okay, because what I have is I have the notes and I have the literature, and I'm going to have to really go through and digest this stuff, because there's a lot more, because everything leads from one question to another question. It takes it to another level, to another level, to another level. So that's kind of where I'm a little mixed up, but it's good. It's all good stuff.
Thank you so much. I really value the honesty also, and actually your confidence to say it's freaking you out. I'm not sure that everyone would feel comfortable to say that, but I'm sure other people are freaked out too. Here's one reason why I think it might freak someone out to speak about gender and sexuality this way. And why, if you are confused, why you might feel confused. We live in a time when gender and sexuality are presented to us as biological facts, right? That there are men, there are women, there are gays, there are straights, there are trans people, and these are all aspects of the physical body, right? There are hormones, there are genetics, there are preferences and orientations. We are born with these things being innate. When we subject that narrative to rigorous critique, it falls apart almost immediately for a number of reasons. One reason it falls apart is because of the truth of science. The truth of science is it's not precise. It's also an agglomeration of impressions. It's a way of processing very disparate kinds of facts into a narrative, if you will. So the first reason it falls apart is because of the nature of science. The nature of science. The second reason it falls apart is because it's so obvious from the moment that we start really thinking about these things, that there is a lot to say about history, politics, the social world in how we understand these issues, the kind of issues that adhere to questions of gender and sexuality. So in a sense, our popular discourse is impoverished by this sort of story that these things are biological. If we're talking about politics, we are not talking about gender and sexuality, or even biology for that matter. So this is a way of speaking about these things that goes against the grain of the zeitgeist. The moment that we are in is not commensurate with this critique. And according to me, if the zeitgeist says something, that's no reason to do it, right? I mean, we should be reading against the grain. We should be pushing back on these given narratives. So it is a different way of thinking than how we are supposed to be thinking about these things right now. The critique in that is by insisting on the social in relation to these terms, we are insisting on a certain kind of critique. And in a sense, I mean, this is my stuff, right? This is what I do. I'm interested in this. But I'm also interested in this because it allows me to think like this. So whatever allows you to think rigorously, deeply, broadly, that's what you're in a university for, to facilitate that kind of thinking. What I am showing you is the ways in which I link these questions to seemingly different kinds of questions, right? And what we're going to do today is more of that. What does a question of sexuality in particular have to do with questions of urbanization, again, of nationalism, of the kind of a critical discussion of space, because that's something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. But whatever I present to you today is not the only thing you can do with this, right? The other thing that might make this seem a bit confusing for some of you is there is a kind of a abiding thread of political theory that goes through questions of sexuality. And in particular, we can trace the career of liberalism through the ways in which sexuality is presented to us as an aspect of the individual self. And as we know from the history of liberalism, the individual is not an individual, right? The individual is a technology, a kind of conceptual technology that allows liberalism to proliferate, to thrive, right? It's almost like a movement, if you will, an intellectual movement that allows many, many kinds of social and economic phenomena to thrive. So rather than think of the world as a bunch of individuals who then have moral valences, a bunch of individual people who do good and bad things to each other, we have to reclaim the social. Because there's a radical potential in reclaiming that social, and there's a reason why the political moment that we are in eschews the social. It's much easier, particularly for conservative politics and conservative governments, it's much easier for them to act on individuals than it is to act on a social world. So for that reason also, we must reclaim the social, particularly in this area that seems to be the opposite of that. This just seems to be about individual characteristics when it's far from that. Fortunately, we have a long history of critique that allows us to do this. So I'm going to share with you some of what I think that critique is about. But before we get to that, I had asked a couple of you, I asked all of you, I think a couple of you have notes on this, but I had asked you all to remind me where we had left off yesterday. So can we start there, please?
universal.
No, for the recording we have to.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on. It's okay.
Yeah. So we had stopped when we were discussing about the whole idea of subjectivity, subjecthood. So you asked us to remind you about universal subject.
Okay.
It comes into existence via these discourses. And before we can plunge into this, you were asking about confusions and
Yes.
the things where we freak out.
Yes.
So I just want to address that. The whole idea of...
Sorry. I need that board. This one. I need this. This one? Thank you. Sorry. Please. But before that, I had asked you about what you're confused about. Yes.
Yeah, so what freaks me out is the gap between my thinking and the institutions around. So when I am in humanities, when I'm in arts, I'm thinking all this. But when I talk about it to people, like my friends, my family, I feel alienated. It's not them who feel alienated.
Yes.
And then yesterday I was reading History of Sexuality, where you are looking at various categories that come into existence. So there's adolescent schoolboy and his sex. So it reminded me of my convent education, where the important ideas of being woman were chastity, purity. And when we talked about sex education, it was more about wedlock, that you cannot do it before you are in the wedlock. So how all the structures that have been through my family, my school and everything, it has reinforced the gender practices that we talked about.
Yes.
So now that I think, I find myself in a group where I feel alienated. And I don't see myself bringing a change there. So that freaks me out.
Yes. Would someone like to respond to this very reasonable freak out? Thanks for introducing that term, by the way.
Actually, I want to add some more. Even when I'm doing this study with special LGBTQ rights, the response I got from some of scholars, they mentioned the more you are dividing the sexual diversities, the more you are become alienated from the mainstream.
More you are dividing means what?
I mean, the more you are categorizing the sexual diversities, the more you are the more you are away from the mainstream.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in academia itself, like as a person who's starting to write her MA thesis, there's this constant. So even in the humanities, there are different kind of disciplinary like arguments and disagreements, of course. But so I don't know if I'm speaking only for myself or a lot of people who have faced this. Is the whole idea of defining concepts that you're using, but in the arena of gender and sexuality and LGBTQ rights, there's a constant fight to not define these things in a particular way. So, what I have been forced to do in my thesis is to bring everything down to a definition. So if you say sexuality, what are you saying? Whom are you talking about?
Yeah.
In each page, you need to know about which sexuality are you talking about. Is this now? If page 1, if you meant sexuality in this way, does it mean that in page 10 will it mean the same thing? Like I have been told to have an entire slide where I say that key concepts in this thesis. But at the same time, I have to define what do I mean by transgender?
Yeah.
What do I mean by I feel so. The thing is, that's my freak out zone where I get scared as to if I give them definitions, it will not only make it a defining, like it will become restrictive, that
Yes.
they'll start thinking about these categories as the be-all, end-all of the work we are doing.
Yes.
And it will stop people from thinking beyond those definitions. So is it okay to actually give disclaimers in a thesis that, or in any work that we're doing, is that these are just working definitions? Or can we circumvent this whole entire obsession with defining things? I mean, obviously we are going to, so when we talk about this object of knowledge and object of inquiry, where do we stop defining? Where do we say, now this is where I stop defining things, and then this work will speak for itself? So that's the kind of conundrum I am in.
Yes. Great. Yeah. Let's keep going. I will give you my perspective on what all of you are saying.
Actually, ma'am, yesterday I had this question while you were leaving regarding, it is somewhere relevant to what she has asked.
Yes, please.
Moreover, I'll just bring a small story in it.
Sure.
I don't know how many of you have watched this movie, Aligarh. Okay. So there was a very beautiful dialogue where this Manoj Vajpayee, he says that how could you define, means when you say gay, how could you define my emotions in this proper term?
Yes.
It is something beyond that.
Yes.
So somewhere when we are categorizing them, putting them as LGBT, so we are again confining them to some proper thing, some proper words, some proper characteristics. So like we are creating a limitation. In order to, instead of getting, actually bringing them into, we are just putting them out. So yeah, means it's just a vicious circle which is being created. So how should we get out of that? And actually, this is what always confuses me. Like in order to remove a power structure, we are again creating one somewhere, which is deliberately or unconsciously, whatever it is. In order to remove some problem, in form of solution, we are again creating a problem. So it's like a vicious circle which is always going on. So how should we get out of it?
Yeah. That's not really what academics do, is it? Resolve things. We don't resolve things. So actually, I think the two of you are saying something similar, I believe, about kind of these definitions and this. So first, I would actually question your use of they. We're putting them in a category. So presumably that means they are someone other than me, right? So if they are being put in a category, I would ask, why are not we, the we of that they, why are the we not in that category also, right? I mean, heterosexuality is also another category. So there is already a kind of a critique of power that we need to understand, even just the statement that you've made. Why is it that the critique of fixity accrues to people who are seen to be not normative? Why is a critique of fixity does not also accrue to people who are normative? And that actually goes to this critique of the universal subject, the normative, the category that is unseen because it is normal. That's just regular people, right? So part of what we're doing when we're sort of critiquing things like terms and definitions and categories is we are talking about how normative, non-normative, marginal, not marginal. I mean, I actually don't like terminology like that in my work because it's too binary. It's not very elegant. We can think of more subtle and better ways of talking about it, but for the purposes of keeping it simple and how we speak to each other, I hope I'm conveying my meaning. I'm sort of saying, do what I say, not what I do. Like, if you can avoid normative, not normative, it's like, it's just not that interesting. But there is a way in which a kind of a normative self gets produced in the process of making these critiques about the non-normative other. Now, I think what you said initially about how, in a way you're sort of making, in trying to undo fixity, you end up reinscribing fixity by using terminology like this. I think that's something that's at the heart of a queer critique right now. So we actually, as scholars, we're not really looking for resolutions to things. We are looking for resolution to things as activists and lawyers. But as scholars, it's actually our job to generate more questions, right? That's a successful critique, if it generates more questions, if we can continue to think. So, this is a problem that cannot be easily resolved, which from a scholarly perspective is amazing. It's wonderful, right? You kind of have to keep thinking about it. Now, as far as sort of, this idea that, well, if you keep making categories, you also divide people, I think there are a lot of ways to counter that, and I actually would suggest that has to be countered. Because we hear something similar about caste. We hear something similar about race. You're just dividing people. And more often than not, that's coming from the dominant group. Right? So you have to also mark that what is at stake in this idea of a kind of unified community, for example. Usually that benefits the group of people who benefit the most. In a hierarchical, we all live all over the world, we live in increasingly stratified societies. So if the dominant group is saying you're being divisive, usually that's a sign that they're scared. Right? Because what are they afraid of? That they're going to lose their voting constituency, they're going to lose their audience, they're going to lose their market, they're going to lose their support. Somebody's going to critique them for the power that they don't deserve, but they have. So that's what I think making the normative, the dominant, this so-called universal subject, making it visible is politically very, very important. And it's something that scholars can also do, right? Now, when you say that you don't want to, again, you don't want to kind of define something as the end-all, be-all, and can you have a disclaimer and a caveat? It made me think about when I was spending more time in activist spaces, more of the time. I was like I was a terrible activist. I mean, I still consider myself an activist and politicized and so forth, but I'm more of a scholar activist than an activist scholar right now. And one of the reasons is, I would go to these meetings and I would sit there and I would say, well, but why is that word on the poster? What does that mean, really? And my comrades would get really annoyed with me, like, shut up. We're going for a protest. So I am also going to be a little annoying to you, and I'll say, what do we mean by a definition? Right? Does a definition describe an object, or does it describe a discourse? So according to me, when you are writing your master's thesis, you are not giving us an objective definition. What you're doing is explaining to the reader what discourses, what lineage of ideas, what genealogy are you drawing from when you deploy a term like transgender, right? You're not trying to describe a fixed set of objects in the world. You are describing for the reader the discourse that you are deploying, the literature that you are deploying, the critiques that you are deploying when you use this terminology. Judith Butler in the 90s was excoriated for the complexity of her language. And now if you go back and read it, it's like obvious, right? She really, it's kind of in our bones that, gender trouble is a very, very legible text now. But initially it was not, because she refused to commit to this objectifying language. That she was like talking about these terms discursively as she was discussing the constructs, the way they came to be. So I do think that it would require, in order to satisfy ourselves, we do need to use somewhat complex language. We do need to make visible the discourses that are at play in order to try to not participate in kind of this idea of a fixed external object, even as we critique that object. Now, I will make a caveat. Very often this critique is interpreted as a plea for fluidity. And that is not what this is. That would be a different critique. And the reason that we need to make that caveat is for those people who are not versed in queer theoretical work, for example, may feel that we are advocating for a perspective on the world where everything is kind of loose and, things change and they change quickly and they can change. And I mean, sure, sometimes you have a friend who had this gender of a partner and then they had this gender of a partner, and that's fluidity. But we're not really talking about that kind of individual, people have different sexual orientations as they move through their lives. What we are talking about is kind of constantly being aware of the discursive production around certain objects of knowledge. We are trying to be aware of the discursive production around certain objects of knowledge. That's the kind of fixity that we are trying to counter. And there may be a kind of a sociological fluidity that we can map, surely, but that's different from this kind of countering this idea that, there are these stable objects, this is how they're defined, they have this chemical structure, blah, 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 right? Does that make sense? Okay. I don't know what to say. The family thing is very tough. But if you're feeling unsettled and challenged, I'm happy. I actually think that, the communities that most of us come from and exist in are also the world, right? Why should they be any different from the rest of the world? It's a space to critique, it's a space to examine, it's also a space to participate in. But yeah, I think it's uncomfortable to have a different perspective than the people around you, and it's okay. Make दो माइक है ना? अच्छा, okay. No, that's okay.
Okay, I just wanted to respond to Prerna's question because in my MA thesis, while I was writing it, I was also struggling with these issues of how do I define without restricting it? And one thing that helped me to at least give me some peace while I'm writing and not be harsh on myself, which I think is also important for people who are working in these arenas, was that these definitions are actually A, working definitions, B, also there is a risk if you do not at every point define, there is a risk that you run into being a universalistic definition of things, of a category, which is not. Especially transgender, as we all know, is a very broad term, and a lot of different experiences as well as identities come into it. So giving inflection to those definitions is important. So if you can work around and think of your definitions, or you providing definitions in terms of you're trying to give different inflections to it, it would actually make your life a bit easier, I think.
Other things, people, confusions, questions, freakouts? Well, I wouldn't replace the words normative and not normative with better words. I would, what I'm trying to do in my work, as are others, is think of a different model for power. Right? So we're not letting normativity go, but, that this sort of, concentric circles of, center, margins, normative, not normative. That comes from an earlier sociological tradition, that schematic. And there is something, no one is marginal all the time, right? For example, that's part of the inelegance of that critique. It does not account for a certain amount of complexity. If you're middle class, you participate in the social world in a certain way, but then if you're not heterosexual, you participate in it in another way, and that does modulate and help define your class privilege. But so it gets complicated right away. But there are certain norms that are sustained through discourses of gender and sexuality. So I wouldn't replace the terms as much as think about the framework. And that may also be something that's challenging for some. The fact that I'm not kind of also giving you a set of objective rules of how these discourses function, but hopefully making visible the frameworks in which certain questions emerge. Right? The larger, broader kind of politics, sociological context, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Good place to start. So the other concepts that I wanted to carry over from yesterday are kind of these. I guess the main concept I wanted to carry over from yesterday was the critiques that come to us from feminist work on the kind of colonial reform movements of the 19th century, and the ways in which those movements create a separate private sphere ostensibly for family and family law in particular. This is a legislated space through in India, in what was India before it was several different countries, through this regime of personal law, which was, in a sense, a bargain that the colonial states struck up to show that they were not interested in controlling every aspect of daily life in the colony. That there was a space of autonomy, there was a separate zone. And remember, this is a bargain that emerges after an armed uprising. Right? That context is very important. So it was like you have to give them something to keep them pacified. And what we got was the private sphere which was the domain of culture, the domain of authenticity, the domain of so-called tradition.
Or you may say to facilitate the dominant of larger section, larger public, to work as a safety valve.
Yes, to work as a safety valve, absolutely. That this is your space. Your space is the space with the women, and you be happy with that. Right. And it was not an inconsequential space. I don't mean to at all sound like I'm being dismissive. I mean, after all, this is the space that we are obsessed with, right? And the space that we also feel is not simply private space. But the idea of the private space does facilitate a certain kind of colonial governance, and it does start to reflect priorities in the kind of the bifurcation of the public and private. Is something that animates European governance for a long time, right? The kind of establishment of this thing called the public sphere. I'm thinking about Habermas and the numerous Habermasian critiques that emerged in its wake. So, this is not kind of coming up from nowhere, but it does kind of take on a unique shape, particularly in the post-independence moment. What I would like to derive from that is not just the idea of women as the site of culture, but sexuality also as the site of culture. Right? So yesterday, and if we look at the history of work on feminist work in South Asia, much of it has done this amazing work of building a body of literature that gives us this critique, that women are the site of culture, they're the site of so-called tradition, they are the site of honor. the idea that women hold the honor of the community also comes from the way that the private sphere is structured. What we need today is also a critique of sexuality that does this work, that disrupts this notion of the private sphere. And hopefully as we move through today's lecture, I'll make it clear why I'm making that comment. Perhaps in order to start us off, we can start with some of the readings that I asked you to do for today. And in particular, this reading by Yasmin Dambia, Turncoat Body, Sexuality and Sex Work Under Militarization in Sri Lanka. Can I just ask for some general comments on this piece? What did you get from this? What are your thoughts? Could I ask someone to summarize a little bit what she's arguing here? Yes, please. Wonderful. Thank you. You have to use the mic, I'm afraid, but it's here. Thank you.
So this article is located in Sri Lanka, which is under armed conflict. Like it is a space of armed conflict.
Was.
And she's talking. She talks about how militarized that militarized space, or the concept of militarized nationalism, creates a condition where women become they become both. There are defined roles for them, but also a condition or an environment where those roles can be transgressed. So, they could be sex workers, or they could be in the military, like they could be like in combative bodies.
Yes.
And that creates a strange sort of situation where their sexuality is regulated, and at the same time there are certain very rigid heteronormative norms imposed on them outside of, like when they are not in fatigues, and also when they are serving a military body.
Okay, wonderful. What else can we say about this in relation to what I just said or what we discussed yesterday?
So again, we see that the whole idea of nationality being fought within the gender perspective, or women, trying to define women, but what they add to it is also ethnicity. So the group that they have mentioned here, LTTE, so they're focusing a lot on the idea of Tamil culture. And this Tamil culture again gets focused on women and their sexuality.
Right.
However, the essay talks about transgressive agents. So there are two line of thoughts that get configured in that transgressive agents. Like one example is that of female combatant. On one side, she's transgressing by not fitting into the idea of women in Tamil culture because she's fighting. However, she has to fit into the ideal of being a heteronormative, like heterosexual woman. But she transgresses at the same time because she's able to fight and she's able to enter the profession which is male, mostly male. Then there are other agents, there are other incidents which they talk about, like this Nithra, who's a sex worker, but however she claims her identity as a mother and also a lover, that she was in love with this man who left her. So there are various spaces that this women occupy which puts this equation of heteronormativity and heterosexual identity at question. And also this reminds me of this novel, Anand Math, where again this whole idea of women entering the Santhal rebellion. So we are talking about the idea of new woman. However, this new woman is seen in relation to her husband. So even when she enters this rebellion where she has to dress like a male, she has to be reminded that she is a woman. She has to give up on her sexuality. She cannot have marriage alliances with anyone. So I could see that trajectory here.
Please.
In this context, I according to me, I have seen the both parties, I mean LTT as well as the Sri Lankan army, use the gender as some kind of a defense strategy to to win the civil war. At the same time, I have seen women become a victim as well as perpetrators during this militarization and during the civil war period. So mostly I have seen LTT have used gender norms as some kind of defense strategies.
Yes.
Yeah. Even the LTTE combatant did not just fight for, they are really love to their nationality and they are freedom fighters.
Yes.
But they fighted against the Sri Lankan army because they just want to come out from the gender oppression. I mean, in some, there are some kind of caste and some kind of class issues in the Tamil women. So they use this as a come out from that, all the minority oppressions. So when they become a combatant, all the people respected them. So they just try to get that respectation from the society.
So in a way, participating as combatants is a way of social mobility.
Yes.
Right, so, and aspirational to actually join the movement as a...
Yeah. So even I have watched some kind of, after the post-war, some kind of combatants interview. So they mention we were part of the LTTE female cadre, not because of we just want to get a part of Sri Lanka for our nationality. Yes. But we just become a part of the first thing. Sri Lankan army killed my father or my sister or my husband or my brother. Sure. So I want to get the revenge.
Right.
The second thing, my husband was a part of the LTT movement. So I just want to, give some kind of motivation to him, and I just want to become a part of LTT. So then I will get some kind of connection to at least to stay with my husband. Yes. At least I will get a chance to see him.
Yes.
The third thing, they just came out because they just want to came out from the gender oppression every day they are facing, especially the low caste Tamil women. Those are the three reasons that she was giving. I become a freedom fighter not because of I love Tamil nation. Because of these three reasons, I came out.
This is you're speaking from your interviews.
No, ma'am. Actually, I have seen an interview. I
You've
didn't
seen
do
the interview.
Yeah. So I noticed these are the three things that they came out. Thank you.
So I think you're raising one issue, which is that this article does kind of focus on the minority perspective, right? The kind of how did the LTTE, because this is now it's kind of an older article, how did the LTTE use the idea of Tamil nationalism to control women's sexuality and women's movement? I think one point that you are raising, or maybe I'm thinking about, is what about the deployment of nationalism within the dominant community, within the non-minority community? There are lots of examples all over South Asia of the critique of tradition and culture as being vested in women and a normative version of sexuality in all kinds of political spectrums, right? So this is not simply, the minority community controlling people, as it were. This is a discourse that proliferates, and one of the interesting things about the discourse is it looks very different in different places. In a sense, if you try to map, the kind of tradition that people are holding on to, the stability of that tradition also falls apart very quickly, right? Which tradition? How many traditions are there? I mean, South Asia is a huge place. It's like millions of so-called traditions, right? So, in a sense, that idea of the woman is the ground on which some of these debates and these battles are waged. In places in India which are having military conflict or some kind of a violent conflict we also see that sexual violence is part of how that conflict, sexual violence against women, is part of how that conflict is waged. What that tells me is we have this critique of gender. We need the critique of sexuality as well. But in a sense, these two critiques are not separable, right? We cannot kind of talk about sexuality and gender together. And I'm wondering if, again, what model, what kind of theoretical framework would we use? In this context, I would suggest that intersectionality is not adequate to the job, because we're not talking about representing different people of different genders and different sexualities within the discourse of tradition, right? What we're saying is that there is a field, there is a discursive field constituted by gender and sexuality, and that field is what people are trying to capture. They're trying to use that in order to, for its own sake, of course, but also to try to wage other kinds of debates. One of the problems with talking about sexuality is, of course, this idea that we don't talk about it, right? This idea that sexuality is something that is not something that is very much discussed. If I think about my students in the U.S. And I teach a class on South Asia, the first thing they'll say is, "Well, that's a traditional place." Right? They're very traditional. I wouldn't want to offend anybody by saying the wrong thing because they're very traditional. They feel that everybody here is like very sida sada and normative and married and nobody drinks or does anything else, or that everyone's very well behaved. So besides that being just completely ridiculous, it's interesting that it's not that different from one of the articles that I asked you to read yesterday or day before. I don't remember. I think not asked you to read, but when I was talking about the Sadia Tur piece, where she said that people in the federally administrated tribal areas, the FATA, that kind of western part of Pakistan, are as a group seen as terrorists, right, by the American military. So they go and they bomb villages, and then later they figure out who was doing something that would be categorized as terrorism and who would not, right? So it's like a profiling on a massive scale, right? It's not a policy that's designed to win friends. It's a policy that's designed to repress and suppress and make other people police each other. I mean, in a sense, that kind of whole-scale notion that, this is a part of the world which is traditional is part of a telos of modernity. It is a telos of progress. Because what does traditional mean, after all? It means fixed. It means unchanging. It means ahistorical. It means it's stuck in a certain time. Oh, they still practice arranged marriage there. Oh, women still wear saris there. Oh, they still eat with their hands. When Oprah Winfrey came to India, I think she was quoted as saying, "Oh, you guys still eat with your hands." Still eat with your hands, right? So what's interesting is that many of those categories of tradition, what people elsewhere would classify as tradition, are also the norms around gender and sexuality that supposedly animate social life for literally everyone in South Asia, or anyone in the non-West as far as they're concerned. I'm not sure all of them know exactly where South Asia is. Once I taught a class on South Asia, and at the end of the semester, the student thanked me for teaching a class on Southeast Asia. So that's also there. But nevertheless, they would still be having this view of the so-called traditional. One of the axes on which that discourse, that kind of normative discourse functions, is this idea that there are some people, some parts of the world where people are free, right? If you are in a traditional zone, you're not free. You're not free to express yourself. You're constrained by limitations that are ancient, right? There are boundaries around what you can do, and those boundaries have not changed ever. For like thousands of years, they're the same. The places that are seen to be different from that are also places that are free, because they're kind of a place where a discourse about sexuality proliferates. Now, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about the history of sexuality, of course. How many of you are familiar with, have read History of Sexuality before by Foucault, or have taught it, studied it? It's this book, History of Sexuality by Michel Foucault. Yeah? Okay. So, since there's several of you in the room who seem to be familiar with the text, you know that what I'm moving toward is the discussion of the repressive hypothesis, right? So I would love to hear one of you try to start us off with what that is and why that might be relevant. Can I ask you, please, since I saw your hand? Yeah, and the repressive hypothesis, if you don't mind. Or anything you want to say about that book.
Yeah, regarding history of sexuality, we see the effects of power in that book, how the power mechanism works, and how those effects functions in the formation of the bodies, that can be male body or female body. Mm-hmm. So, actually, I acknowledged some of the comments given by Foucault in my first chapter of my PhD.
Great.
And that was related to sodomy and so many other non-normative models. Sorry to use this word.
No. I please use it. I'm
okay.
Just sort of.
So one of the points that strikes me is that there was a change in the focus also. Like, yes. If we see homosexuality as a term or as an identity didn't exist in the ancient times, but its practice was there.
Sure.
But
yes.
Okay. So as Foucault says that it was transposed into interior androgyny, hermaphrodism of the soul. So now it has become a species. Now it has become a legitimate identity. Unlike the secret sodomy act, now it has become sodomite from the sodomy act.
Yes.
So it's a change in focus. Now, so these are there are so many changes in focus regarding the formation of sexuality and all. And so many points will overlap with Foucault and Derrida or Butler and all these things. And whenever I think about the terms, some of us were talking about the terms, the conferring title to the terms. Why do we need to give terms to that? And that also, that movie Aligarh, that Manoj doesn't address himself as gay, but still he has some gay sensibilities. But he is not acquainted with this term gay. But he does not, because he does not address himself as gay. And gay is also an illegitimate identity. It's a Western construction of identity. So, it's not the same-sex identities or all these things are not always does not always result from westernized knowledge. It exists. If you see any kind of texts, any kind of ancient texts, you can see all these queer couplings or queer models in Mahabharata also. Shikhandi and Arjuna as Brihannala, and the camaraderie or the friendship between Duryodhan and Karn. So these are the things that will come. Now, in the 19th century, it has become a species. It has become a legitimate identity. Yes. Now we can refer. Now we are able to address legitimately, unlike before.
Yes.
So there are so many things also. It will take time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Would anyone like to add to this wonderful summary of history of sexuality, please? Okay, great. Yes, try.
So, I think I'm going to pick up from where he ended.
Okay.
So basically, the idea is, so what Foucault's basically trying to argue is that this idea that us talking about sexuality now is a huge deal, or it's revolutionary.
Yeah.
That is problematic. I mean, that's what he's trying to sort of point out. So the repressive hypothesis in itself means that, so this idea that sexuality used to be fluid and, it used to be less judged or not put into boxes per se, and how after the rise of the bourgeoisie, in the 18th century, suddenly sexuality itself was repressed. That is his definition of repressive hypothesis. So what he's saying is that the repressive hypothesis, he explains that it is because of this common understanding that sexuality now, the way we talk about it now, is revolutionary. So he's trying to say that this, in fact, this is not entirely the case. I mean, sexuality was talked about. It wasn't exactly repressed, but it was talked about even more, but in certain terms and in certain ways, like medicalized terms. So homosexuality or sodomy, these things were not repressed per se. They were talked about, but they were talked about in a different context so as to make it perverse, so as to make it abnormal.
So to link both of your comments, in a sense what he's saying is the sodomy did not exist before the sodomite. Right? That this kind of, to separate this as a unique, special category of practice, that is what the incitement to speech has done. Yeah? Okay.
I mean, so that is basically it. I mean, the repressive hypothesis in itself is what he is trying to, I wouldn't say negate, but he's trying to explain how this idea, this common understanding, is indeed not what we think it is. Yeah, that is
great. Thank you. Does anyone want to add to this? Thanks.
Thank you. The first thing that I remember, he talked about the 17th century, and he was talking about shameless discourse. How
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Shameless discourse.
Shameless discourse.
In the 17th century, how people were very licentious and very open. For me, this was kind of a very Protestant progression, because with the bourgeoisie came repression of sexuality, because the repression was work versus pleasure, and pleasure was frowned upon because it did not have a monetary value. It took away from those things that people needed, which was money and things. So the discourse about sexuality becomes relegated to the household, and it becomes relegated to the bedroom. And
to the private.
Right, to the very, very private sphere. And the other thing that I remembered on it was the outlets of confession, psychiatry, and prostitution.
Yes.
And those were the only means outside of it. And today, apparently, we still are there. And I think we are, because you were saying something about the U.S. People are very prudish.
Yeah.
And you cannot talk about a lot of things.
Right.
Even though you see these horrible films or they call them horrible or whatever. But, it's very interesting because it's like schizophrenia. Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. It's very easy to break rules. Birna.
What I understood of this text when I first read it and I've reread it is that Foucault is not really concerned with whether we were repressed or not. Like, he's not really concerned with repression.
Yes.
as such.
Correct.
I don't think that's his obsession at all. He does not. I think more of his his idea is to contextualize this kind of the repressive. And I don't think he doesn't say there was no repression and that the Victorians did not repress or Victorian age was not characterized by repression. But I think he's more interested in the fact that this repressive hypothesis was actually used as a smokescreen or as a pretext to produce discourse, which led to production of discourses around sexualities through mechanisms like the psychiatry and the medicalized discourse. So is that in trying to save yourself from talking about sex, you actually end up talking about sex in different ways. Like in combating sexual repression, you are just talking about sex. But yeah, so that's what I think.
That's very helpful because I think that is a certain reading of the history of sex, that repressive hypothesis in particular. I think what he's actually doing is a little bit deeper. And the reason it's deeper is because he's saying that the discourse of repression is the discourse of sexuality. It doesn't mask the discourse of sexuality. It is the discourse of sexuality. So this is highlighted my favorite line from this book, where he essentially says, why do we say with so much passion, so much resentment against our most recent past, against our present, and against ourselves, that we are repressed? The question is not why are we repressed? The question is why do we say we are repressed? And the say there, that's the discourse. What is the discourse of repression that produces sexuality? That was a thing that I started with on the first day. This discursive production of certain concepts, of certain categories, of certain types. That is, I'm sort of speaking, I'm channeling my inner Foucault when I'm saying that. He is saying the discourse of repression itself, and he shows that, look, in his context, in his time, there are all of these, in his time meaning the historical period that he discusses in History of Sexuality, there are actually all of these spaces that produce a discourse of sexuality. Psychiatry, the confessional, the idea of the normative family home. Now, there's two things that are deeply problematic about Foucault. One is his ostensible lack of a gender analysis. So he's been taken to task for that by people much, much, much smarter than me. But it's out there. You should know about that critique also. The other problem with Foucault is his apparent kind of erasure of the French colonial project. So the French colonial project in Algeria. So at the time that he was writing, there was a robust debate about French colonialism and Algerian independence in particular. He was part of some of those movements. He was a radical himself. He was there in 1969 in Paris. He was on the streets. So it's very odd that we do not see that in his writing. And perhaps if he had lived no longer, he would have come to that. Maybe it's in his notes. We don't know. It's part of the estate. But he's kind of talking about Europe as if it's a closed system. And that is also a problem, and that scholars like Ann Stoler have actually done things around that and made that critique. So it's not unproblematic to be reading Foucault we're in India today, to be reading Foucault here when he is kind of talking about this very Europeanist model. But there are things we can take from it, and I'm using this concept because this is a text that circulates among you. It circulates within the field of gender and sexuality studies in South Asia. And there's a reason for that. And I think one of the reasons for that is he gives us a way to think about the discursive production of certain tropes, types, categories, concepts. What is the what is the way in which a kind of a theory and a discourse of sexuality is produced through its ostensible erasure in South Asia? That is a question that we can productively ask. So with respect to this, your comment about, the gay identity as this Western thing in India, for example, there's a lot to say about that. And, what I'm trying to argue elsewhere is that there is something today that we could call South Asian queer studies, right? That we would not have been able to say that 10 years ago, but I think this is now a field. And that field has certain characteristics. And one of the characteristics it has is a very intense concern with nomenclature. What things are called, what categories of practices, identities are called. So whether you call yourself lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, Gothi, Panthi, Hijra. When I was younger, some Bengali queer women in the US were trying to establish a term Shamkami as a way to talk about lesbian in the Bengali context, at least. I don't think it ever stuck, but it was an attempt. So there has been a profound concern with nomenclature, in part because there has been a concern with queer politics as a neo-colonial project. And there's a way we can critique that through a use of the repressive hypothesis. So for example, we could say, well, we could say this is simply imposed from elsewhere. And maybe to some extent we can say that these terms do circulate, they do originate someplace. I mean, first of all, if you're using an English term, it doesn't come from here, probably, not historically. Like the term gay does have a certain historical provenance that comes from the US and Western Europe. But to say that it's simply imposed would imply that there was no discourse that we could call a discourse about queer intimacy between men, if we're talking about gay. There's no discourse of queer intimacy between men that precedes the use of that term in the South Asian context. So what is that discourse of intimacy between men? Well, I'm thinking about, numerous anecdotes of people who don't identify themselves as gay but have sex, men who have sex with other men, and that category, MSM, is something that has been used to try to define this zone of practice and affect and affiliation. But what's interesting is if you talk to people in that milieu, people who are not English speaking, and what do they call what they're doing? Lots of things. For example,
there was a word which I was in a field work, and they were talking of each other in words as bun pav, mitha chawal, this kind of, and it was really interesting. And when you ask them about if they know about these words, which there's a certain class of people who are using it in the queer politics in India, they just say, no, that doesn't just suit the way we live our life. So the word gay, they know about it. The one whom I was talking about, they know about it, but they don't relate with it. They are much happier with calling themselves bun pao. So it was really interesting. And then, but then even it's very easy to say that these are vernacular terms like Koti and Panthi.
yeah.
But then you have to see them in a certain context of the AIDS industry which came about. So I have heard like a lot of people say that Koti is actually gay in India, which is, I don't think it's true because the word itself has a history of its own. But yeah, so that's one thing that I would contribute.
Great. One word, rather than even the terms that you're sharing with us, those are also, in a way, identitarian terms, right? They're describing roles and types and things like that. A kind of a wonderful and different kind of term that I've heard is just masti. Ye to masti hai. This is not.
The word kush is used in the lesbian context.
Right. Right. As an alternative to the identitarian term or as a way of describing the practice?
I think it was trying to get a different nomenclature.
Right.
As opposed to what's seen as the Western.
So then that would be, ordinally, that would be a different kind of term, right? Kush is trying to replace another identitarian concept. So it's not disrupting the identitarian concept. It's trying to come up with a local way, like Gothi or Banthi. Masti is the practice. It's what you do. It's not what you are, right? What you are is, Maharashtrian, middle class. Maybe you say that your caste name for what you are. You are not masti, right? Hum masti karte hain, right? So when I was starting the project I'm working on now, which doesn't really have a name, I've been calling it my big gay project. I was in a space in Bombay where people who identified themselves as Gothis were soliciting clients for sex from not even from Banthis. I mean, they might jokingly call them Banthis, but they were basically soliciting clients, male clients for sex. And everybody was calling themselves Gothi, and I was sort of asking, trying to be thought I was being clever and provocative by saying, why do you say Gothi? And he said, "Kyunki hum hi-fi nahi hain." You are hi-fi, so you say lesbian, gay. We are not hi-fi, so we say Gothi Panthi. It's like that, right? So, I mean, the richness of the discourse of sexuality in South Asia cannot be minimized, right? I mean, in a sense, everyone is talking about it all the time, but in ways that do not conform to a kind of normative incitement to speech, a commitment to certain terms, an object-defining set of rules and categories. And again, I'm not trying to romanticize and say we're doing it cooler and better than other people in the world, but I'm saying that there is a different way that these discourses play out, and in a sense, to deploy Foucault, it's not why don't we talk about these things, it's why do we say we don't talk about these things. Right? That's an important part of how the discourse proliferates. And of course, it does have to do with class, as in my example, hi-fi obviously referred to my status as a bourgeois elite person in that space. But it might be a kind of direction that some of you also would want to pursue in your own work. Okay. There were a couple of other things I wanted to show you, things that I didn't ask you to read, because we don't have the time. But I had sort of categorized this in the kind of the possibilities of this of talking about sexuality in particular in a certain way. So I think, what time should we break? 11:30? Okay. So I just want to kind of introduce one more thing. I'm just going to introduce the concept, and then after the tea break, we can come back and I'll give you an example of what I mean by this concept. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with a critique of sexuality. And of course, at the outset, the main thing that we can and must do is talk about what we mean when we say sexuality. Are we meaning object choice? Are we meaning a certain kind of regime of practices and norms around sexual practices? Are we meaning something else? Many things could fall within this rubric. Not one single person cannot talk about all of it, right? You cannot talk, and in one work, in your master's thesis, in your article that you're writing, in your dissertation, you cannot talk about the entire field. It's too vast. So, for example, when I was trying to write about sex work, I thought I was doing a critique of sexuality and class. And I quickly learned that I had to be very careful ascribing the term sexuality to sex workers, because nothing that I observed in my fieldwork told me anything about the sexuality of the women selling sex. Right? It was not them selling sex was not their sexuality. It was their livelihood. And making that distinction was very important when in a time and place when sex work is so very stigmatized. Right? These are loose women. They like to have a lot of sex. They're promiscuous. Actually, they may not be promiscuous. They may not be, even they're doing a job, right? I mean, we don't say that about somebody working in an office. Oh, she likes to sit in AC all day. She's so weird. Because it's not stigmatized, right? It's your livelihood. It's what people are doing. And it's happening within a capitalist regime of material concerns that, that there's a certain alienation that all workers experience in the context of the money that they make, right? So why should this describe anyone's sexuality? So we have to be very careful, right, how we're deploying these terms. One thing that helped me to be careful in that sense was the wonderful body of work inspired by Marxian critiques that kind of agglomerates around questions of space. So I want to tell you about this kind of this body of work, which many of you may be familiar with. I'm thinking about people like David Harvey, Doreen Massey, Henri Lefebvre, of course. To some degree, this deployment of this literature also requires an engagement with critique of the public sphere. Those of us who are not working in a European or American context have to do an extra layer of work to try to untangle the Europeanist references that inform that work, because, of course, all of that work traces itself back through the history of Europe. So, rather than saying, well, what was happening in the metropole was happening in the colony, finished, we have to actually think about the different threads. So the article that we didn't have, the chapter we didn't have a chance to talk about, but that I'm going to keep referencing, that Mrinalini Sinha chapter from the South Asian Feminism's text, gives us one example of how we might do this, of saying, the whole construct of gender is, doesn't that binary construct where women are trying to get equality in relation to men, that isn't really how gender functioned, if it functioned at all, as a trope in South Asia prior to the colonial encounter, right? So by the time we get to the establishment of a private sphere, we've already gone through several layers of kind of mapping gender in a space where it functioned quite differently. And she gives two examples for that. One, she gives the example of the transition from the authority in the Bengali home, in the middle-class Bengali home, being the authority of the elders to the authority of the young husband, right? So the kind of the circumscribing the idea of the family to the nuclear unit, in which the husband is the head of the household and not the older relatives, who would have been men and women. The other example she gives is that there was a kind of, when she was talking about Afsane Najmabadi's work, there's also a model of gender in which gender is mapped in relation to a community identity, right? And in the Iranian example, Najmabadi shows that all gender expression was mapped in relation to adult men at some point in time. And in a sense, in Iran. And in a sense, this is not, you can make what you will of it. In our binary gender universe, that's a problem, because then that's reifying masculinity. But in that context, it works differently, because there isn't this sort of separate mapping of men and women, right? There are individuals in their communities, and then people are sort of mapping their gender expression in relation to this universalized ideal of adult masculinity. So that discussion about power will necessarily be different in that context. One thing that I think all of this might benefit from is a kind of materialist location in the politics of space. So when I say materialist, I mean literally space. How does space get constructed? How does it function? And this is from Lefebvre's classic text, The Production of Space, which is an older text, but it took a longer time to be translated into English. So it's not as old within the English scholarly context as it is within the French. In a nutshell, what Lefebvre shows us is that space is also a discourse. It is a physical space. You know, we are in a physical environment with four walls and a ceiling and a floor. But what makes this a classroom is a discursive interpolation. Right? This doesn't feel and sound and operate as a classroom without a discursive apparatus that makes it so. It doesn't even become a classroom because there's a camera there and I'm standing up here pretending like I know more than you and I'm like the teacher and you're the students. This is a discourse that we're all part of. We have been disciplined into understanding this as a certain kind of space in which certain things happen. Right? So none of us would dream of transgressing that. It's not in our bodies to be able to do that. You know, no one is going to like set up a stove in the corner of the room and start making chapatis, right? Because that's not what this space is for. We know that. It's in us to know that. So what Lefebvre does for us is show us there is a discourse around the production of space. And that's very powerful insight for a critique of sexuality. Because sexuality in our time continues to be domesticated, supposedly shielded from public view, private, as I said yesterday and the day before, it's structured as the truth of the self. And it's not just a truth of the self, it's a truth of the interiority of the self, right? It's like the most true of yourself that you can be, the most private version of yourself is where your sexuality exists, which is also why attacking somebody on the basis of sexuality, whether it's through a sexual assault or whether it's through a homophobic attack, is the worst you can hurt someone, right? Because it's structured as a truth of the self. The meaning of violation, the meaning of violence is structured around this idea of sexuality as a truth of the self. And you could use a Lefebvrean critique to say that this is also spatialized in our minds. It's spatialized. So it's not just sex happens in the bedroom. It's also sexuality is something that is integral to the interiority. It's an internal structure. The counter of that is it's not social. It cannot be social because it's like your bones. It's who you are. Right? If it's social, it's false. It ceases to exist as an essential aspect of the self. Right? It's subject to change. It's subject to historical change. It's not real. We see some of this actually in some of the kind of discourse on transphobia. This kind of very cruel comments like, "Oh, look, this person is pretending to be a woman. They're not really a woman." And so then the counter has to be, of course, I'm really a woman because I was born into the wrong body. Right? As opposed to, I have a body and I am wearing clothes, and that's the beginning and the end of it. And I feel like doing this. Right? You have to kind of prove that there's something essential, eternal, and interior. So it's that interiority that I want to stress in relation to this discourse of space. Of course, that's not the discourse of space that Lefebvre intends. What Lefebvre intends is a discourse of space in which you can also understand social stratification. Right? So I'm going to leave it there, and then when we come back, I'm going to give you an example of how I use this in my earlier work on sex work. Okay? Haven't we normally been having half-hour breaks? What happened today? Everybody quickly came back inside. Okay, I'm just making some notes to keep myself on track. So this is the cover of my child, my book, Street Corner Secrets. It was a very long-term ethnography of sex work in Bombay. It was a multi-sided ethnography. One thing that I was trying to do in the course of this project was think about the relationship between sexuality and class, what I was calling sexuality and class, sexuality and questions of materialism. And one of the reasons I was doing that is because I was feeling very irritated with the current regime of sexuality, the discursive regime under which we all labor. Which relegates sexuality to the idea of the personal, the individual. So I want to clarify that what I was doing in the earlier part of our session was I was making a metaphor between a kind of psychoanalytic interiority and a spatial interiority. Right? So when I was saying that interiority is just the adjective form of interior, right? Andar. So I was making a metaphor between spatial interiority, inside the home, inside the bedroom, inside the kind of physical environment that's called the private space, with the idea of the private sphere, which is not the same thing as private space, and with psychoanalytic, psychic interiority. Right? So there were three different kinds of inside, if you will, that I was evoking. Does that make sense? Shall I write it down? So interiority is a quality of the interior, right? It's not adjectival, but it's a different kind of noun than just interior. Interiority is a kind of qualitative way of describing this idea of the concept of what happens in this case in the psychic. Right? So I'm drawing from the psychoanalytic notion of interiority. This thing that happens in your mind, that happens in your heart, if you will, whatever that is. Then I was also talking about the private sphere. And of course, public and private are relational. Right? Private doesn't exist without public. Interiority also doesn't exist without exteriority. Right? These are all relational terms. So I was talking about the private sphere, which is not a physical space. It's also a discursive construct. I mean, even the space is a discursive construct, but let's stop for a moment. Private sphere has to do with things like the way that the family is legislated, the way that sexuality is legislated, the idea of some things are private and some things are public. Right? So the private sphere, the public sphere, these do have to do with kind of in Habermasian terms, a public sphere does relate to the historical notion of the European commons. This instantiation of a public sphere, a public space in which people argued and interacted with each other as individuals and not as sort of representatives of their so-called communities. For Habermas, this is a very important way that democratic institutions also emerge in the European context. Then there's private space. Now, as a scholar of sexuality, what I'm interested in is the way that these three ordinal, I keep saying ordinal, and by that I mean the order of things, right? The level at which we are talking. Are we talking at the level of space? Are we talking at the level of kind of abstraction in which space is, meaning is made of space? Are we talking about some other kind of discursive environment? So I'm interested in how this notion of the, in a vernacular way, I'm interested in how this notion of the inside structures ideas about sexuality. So one example that I'm offering you of that idea of interiority is this idea that the thing that is most inside of you is the thing that is most true about you, right, individually. So if sexuality is part of your being as a human being, it's part of what structures you individually, it's the most true thing about you, and therefore it's the most vulnerable part of you, right? So if you attack someone on the basis of sexuality, either physically or verbally, it's like you're attacking this core of their being, right? You're like shooting an arrow into their heart, right? And if you do it on a mass scale, like if all of the women of a certain community are assaulted by the police or by an extrajudicial force that's acting on behalf of a multinational corporation, that is attacking that community at its most vulnerable, right? And it's considered to be an attack on the being of that community, on the constitution of that community, which is why we consider the mass use of sexual assault on communities as an aspect of genocide, right? Because it is literally trying to wipe a people out because, in part, of the discourse of sexuality that structures this interior aspect of the self as the truest part of the self. So even if, all of that critique is not coming across, well, I would just like to clarify that I'm talking about three different kinds of inside. I'm talking about the psychic, the psychoanalytic interiority. I'm talking about the private sphere and the private space. Now, with respect to the concept of the private, feminists have done a lot of work to disrupt this notion of public and private. So after, and I'm going to evoke the Mathura rape case for the purpose of my this discussion, but with the caveat that I'm not suggesting that the Mathura rape case is the beginning of feminism in India, right? That would be problematic for a number of reasons. And V. Geeta discussed this when I saw her speak last week in Delhi. I hope she talks about it again here if she has time. So I'm not saying this is like the most important thing that happened. It's not like the origin story that I'm giving you of feminism in India. But I'm saying that after Mathura, one of the interventions that feminists had to make was to argue that domestic violence and rape are violations committed by the state, right? If a woman is assaulted or attacked on the basis of her sexuality, or if she is assaulted and attacked in her home through other kinds of physical violence, and that is the state abdicating its responsibility towards one of its citizens, right? That was a very, very important intervention that feminists in this country made in the 80s. In order to do that, they had to say this ostensible division between public and private, the public sphere and the private sphere, this sort of dichotomy, this was not this is not, this, I'm so afraid I'm sorry already for breaking this. I'm sorry now. I apologize. I'm really sorry. This is a false distinction. Because the other thing about the private sphere is that this is also the space into which the state does not enter, right? That's the colonial legacy of the personal laws and the public, the private and the public. And feminists in the West did this too, but they had a different set of histories and parameters and legal apparatuses that they had to contend with in order to do this. For example, the lack of recognition of marital rape, right? That's a big issue in how the public and the private works to maintain a status quo of gender-based inequality, in part because it relegates both women and the notion of sexuality to the private space. Well, the police won't do anything because it's not my business, right? Because nothing has been taken. If your house was robbed, then they would do something because that's a violation against the state, because it's a violation of private property. But if something is done to the body of a woman, that's nobody's business because that's private, right? So feminists had to do a lot of work to say this cannot stand, this is not legal, this is absolutely the state's responsibility to protect women legally, right? And we have laws that do this. We have anti-rape laws, we have laws against assault. Those laws need to be enforced as much in the home space as elsewhere, right? And yes?
There's often a critique also that's offered to this question of marital rape or to questions of rape where sex at some point may have been consensual in that location that you have shared,
right.
Which is that especially when it's not a marital relationship.
When it's not a marital relationship, yeah.
Which is, it's women, they really mean it. They just don't know it. And they have fun while they want to, and then they realize that this person doesn't want to marry them, which they probably knew before. They just changed their mind. They're just doing this to torture them. Which seems bizarre to me. But there's that counter, which is very prevalent actually sometimes in terms of how often it's said or written about the topic.
So what meaning do you derive from that? I mean, this.
Well, I think it's hogwash because I think that for women that are speaking about what has happened to them and making it public, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do already when they know they're going to be attacked. That's one thing. The second thing is I have issues with it because of the way consent is being viewed as being something that if at that time you didn't say anything about it, then surely you consented to the act or the acts or the relationship. And the third thing which I'm ambivalent about is how do we look at this question of the promise of marriage as being a grounds for rape? I'm not really sure how to answer that one. I'm not for or against it as being right or wrong, but I'm not really sure how to address that. Which is, I guess, why I'm also raising that question and saying that this is another counter that's maybe I find very hard to argue against. Not because I don't think it's crap, it's hogwash, but because I don't know, maybe I don't really have a way of talking about the basis, which one is consent, which I can talk about. I give this tea example, which is pretty famous now, about the cup of tea, right? Every time when someone comes to your house, you offer them a cup of tea, and just because they took tea the first time doesn't mean they want tea the next time. You've got to ask, and until you get an absolute yes, it's not a yes,
right?
Which is reductive, but helpful. The question about marriage as being central to consent, that I don't know about. I mean, in terms of how to address, really, I don't know, it's tricky.
I think it's tricky. I'm not going to be able to address everyone's questions, and I probably should be a little more interested in heterosexual marriage than I am. But I don't really know that much about it. But what can I say? I mean, I do think that there's a very interesting, robust literature on consent and the history of consent in relation to many different kinds of frameworks. I mean, with respect to this sort of, so I heard two things in what you said that resonated with things I am thinking about, and one is the deployment of false consciousness, right? Oh, she wanted to, even though she's saying she doesn't, right? And that usually that deployment of false consciousness doesn't really get us anywhere, right? I mean, you can't second guess what people say. You can't map something. Usually when we are mapping false consciousness, what we're mapping is the status quo norms, right? That's not like, that's, you're rocking the boat. We're just going to say that you didn't mean to rock the boat, right? The second thing I'm hearing is, this kind of promise of marriage. I can't help but feel that somewhere that's economic also, right? Not that, the woman is trying to get something from the man, but that if we had an economic understanding of marriage, we would also perhaps be able to account for some of these other narratives. Now, I can't say more than that because what you're asking are some fairly specific sociological questions, and I don't have examples or experience in dealing with those kinds of things. But I think that, a legal framework is made by people. It has a history. There are certain biases inherent in that framework that come from that history. So, for example, outraging the modesty of a woman, we probably wouldn't make a law like that today. But the fact that it's on the books means that it's a law that people can use, right? So, I think of the law as creating space, for better and for worse. And then people enter in that space, also for better and for worse, right? But these are very practical concerns usually that cause people to bring cases like this. So, not as rigorous of an answer as I might be able to offer in another realm. I'm sorry. So that's just, I clarified private space, private sphere, psychic interiority. These are not the same thing at all, but I think perhaps a useful way to think about it for the purposes of what we're doing here is that these are metaphors for one another sometimes. They resonate with one another metaphorically. What I wanted to tell you all about, I'm just using the book as a visual device. I'm actually going to explain to you. So I told you that I was interested in space, and space as a discursive construct, right? So the example that I gave is the example of this classroom, right? The easy example, we all participate in it. And when I say that the classroom is a classroom because of the discourse that makes it a classroom, I think you understand what I mean, right? There's a physical environment. This is made of certain building materials. It has 6 sides, maybe a few more because there's that diagonal wall over there. But, it has a certain shape and structure physically. But then what makes it a classroom is something that's discursively produced, that we all discursively produced by virtue of having been both students and, for some of us, teachers within an environment like this, right? That's the discursive production that is not instantaneous. It's not like we have a conversation like, well, is this our classroom? Okay. It's like we learn this over long periods of time to the point where it feels natural, right? There's some things that we just would not do in this room because it's a classroom. And there's basically one thing we would do because it's a classroom. So by that same notion, I was very interested in space in relation to sex work because what I ended up doing in a somewhat chaotic and confused manner was eventually identify 3 different places in Bombay where women were soliciting clients for sex. So cisgender women were soliciting cisgender male clients for sex. So I was not talking about male sex workers. I was not talking about transgender sex workers, although they were also part of this milieu. But I was talking specifically about women, and in part because the spatial segregation of sexual commerce in big cities like Bombay is also segregated according to gender identity. Right? The cisgender men solicited somewhere. There was a Hijra brothel in the red light district, but also Hijra sex workers solicited other places. So it was not like everybody was standing in a row on the street and then a client would come and choose who they wanted to have sex with. In the course of this kind of chaotic methodology, what I ended up doing was talking about construction workers' naka, a street where women solicited, women who were street-based sex workers, and women who were brothel-based sex workers. And one of the reasons that I was doing that was not to compare these places spatially, but to compare them to kind of show that whether a woman is working full-time as a sex worker or whether she's working as a construction worker and sometimes sells or trades sex, they are all the same people. These are all lower caste migrant workers who are landless and from rural areas, mostly in Maharashtra and to some degree in Karnataka. Are you okay, Sneha? I feel so sorry. You must be feeling so bad. One of the reasons I was trying to show some continuity in terms of the migration history of these different groups of people was to show that sex work as it happens in the brothels in Mumbai is not exceptional, right? And so that's about the kind of larger discourse of human trafficking and these policies that are kind of intended to empty the brothels as a way to protect women. And so I'm not going to get into all of that because that could be its own story and its own session. But what I kind of noticed was that, I was thinking, well, why do we think of the brothel as a special space? Why is it a unique space for sex work? Because the Naka that I was going to was certainly not seen as a space where sex work happens. Right? That was a space where women solicited clients for sex. The place where women were soliciting from the street was also not seen as a space of sex work. That was a very contested place. That's where the police were the most active. They were like lathi charging the women as they were walking on the street because it was meant to be regulated as a place where sex work did not happen. Now the brothel, the red light district in Bombay is very interesting because it's so iconic, right? At one point in time it was seen to be it was considered to be the largest red light district in Asia. At one point in time. It's in a lot of films. It's in a lot of stories going back to Manto's time, but also preceding that time. It's actually a part of the imaginary of the city. This is the red light district. This is where, in a sense, this is where sex work happens. So when I was thinking about this, question of space, because I was thinking, these spaces are very different and they're discursively produced very differently. One thing I noticed was that there is a historical thread that links the red light district with other kinds of spaces like red light districts. So the kotha, for example, or the kind of back room of a nefarious mafioso. There's always this sense that there is a special place in the city, a dark place where sex work happens. So if you think about space relationally, because that's part of what the Lefebvrean critique does, it thinks about spaces in relation to other spaces, and then Foucault's one of the last, kind of near the end of his life, he wrote that wonderful essay on heterotopias, in which he invokes spaces like the brothel and the park and and he sort of says that, a heterotopia is also a resonant space. It's, like one brothel is every brothel, in a sense. Even this is, one classroom is every classroom. So then using this Lefebvrean kind of critical geographic use of space as relational, one thing that I ended up arguing in the book is that the way in which, if we look at the historiography of the red light district itself, what we find is that it's always a private space. It's always an interior space, and it's always a clearly demarcated space. Well, what does that mean if we think about urban space as relational? One of the things it means is that if sex work is happening in this place, it is not happening anywhere else. Right? If it's relational, and I'm not saying somebody decides this and then makes it happen and imposes it on someone else. I'm saying that there is a social process by which, a social and historical process that we can look at, we can map the history of these spaces, and we can see that one of the ways that the idea of the red light district functions is to think of it as a space where sex work happens, so that the rest of the place, it doesn't happen, right? And at one point in time, I used this theory of the spectacle to do this, that the kind of situationist idea of the spectacle, that if the spectacle also reifies a certain space as a space for sex work, so that other spaces relationally are its other, in a sense, right? So I'm giving you this as an example of what I have done with a kind of spatial critique of sexuality, kind of to show you that here's one place that a critique like this can go, but also to say that there's a lot of potential around kind of critically and materially analyzing sexuality with respect to the phenomenon of, the other relational phenomenon, which is the relation between the rural and the urban. Sexuality structures an idea of urban life, just like it structures an idea of rural life. Right? So if I could transition a little bit to thinking about contemporary LGBTQ politics, in terms of the kind of discourse of queer and transgender identity that we are confronted with today in our region, what could we say about the difference between the rural and the urban? Excuse me. Yes? And why would LGBTQ people only exist in the urban? Is that the only reason? Elitist. Good. Why?
Because it is largely an English-speaking community that is engaging in these policies. As you mentioned earlier, the high-fi people who are engaging. So they are not seeing other communities taking part in Pride. They only see these English-speaking elitist people who are the do-gooders trying to create a spectacle and not as anything other than that.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Also, there was an interesting.
Oh.
No, so the reason, if anyone, what happened in the Pune Pride post, which was put on Facebook.
I don't know about this.
Yeah. So I'm forgetting the name of the organization. So yeah, some trust, right? I'm forgetting. Yeah, Sampatika Trust. Yes. So they put basically this orders of civility in Pride, like no dhol tamasha, no dance, no opulent dresses, no political slogans. And there was a lot about how you have to dress, how you can speak. I mean, it speaks of how a certain kind of anxiety exists in these urban spaces of this rural, even the rural identities, which they think are uncivilized. There's this constant pressure for them to urbanize themselves to be considered citizens, or like even LGBT if you have to be an LGBT citizen in this country, you need to be a certain way. So even after recognizing transgender communities or communities from the rural area, if you have to be legible citizens to be accorded rights, you have to be civil. So it's very interesting how citizenship and civility actually work together. And Pune, that whole post was very symbolic of that kind of, if you want us to fight for your rights, you need to be in our fold, but that it has to be in a certain way. So yeah, certain markers of the good LGBT citizen, you know. Yeah.
Yes. Please.
Would it be also because if you think of extreme rural areas where, so like my village, where all my cousins got married by 11, 12 years of age, female cousins especially. Even male cousins got married by 15, 16. By 13, they already had started having kids. And so the basic thing is that they do not even know that an option to be homosexual exists. That there is an option to be something other than to be in a heterosexual marriage which their parents would fix. So that's more of a question than a suggestion.
Yeah.
I would like to add something. There is an urge to link LGBTQI politics with modernity.
Yes.
And what we model as modernity is often colonial modernity. And so what comes to the front is often the English speaking, upper class looking queer people. I don't know about national media. In Kerala, the spokespersons of queer movement who come to the media is often the trans woman who is dressed up as an upper caste woman, dressed in sari, wearing this gold ornament.
Are you speaking about that Satyamev Jayate?
No, I'm talking.
I mean, there are many examples like this.
Kerala media, yeah. So there is sudden urge to link LGBTQIA with modernity, and then there comes this our mainstream modernity concepts, and maybe that's why we think that this is a pure urban concept. And there are many other concerns they face, not just about pride and mobility, but the rural queer persons experience harassment on a daily basis, like workplace harassment, thrown out of their houses. So I think maybe because they have bigger issues to be addressed, that media doesn't want to showcase.
Yes, please.
Even I just want to add some of context regarding to the urban and rural space in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
If you look at the urban space in Sri Lanka, mostly the people who are talking about the LGBTQ rights and they're presenting themselves as people who are coming from LGBT community, they are more open to the world. I mean, globalization has done so much impact on LGBTQ movement in Sri Lanka, especially in case of Colombo. The moment like Equal Grounds, they have so much link with the international LGBTQ task force. Most of members are, Sri Lanka, Equal Ground members are members of the international LGBTQ task force.
Yes.
And even, especially if you're looking at the Colombo rights, you won't find any rural LGBT community person are coming to attend the Colombo Pride. Most of them are the people who are attending that Colombo Pride are fluent to talking in English and coming from some kind of elites movement, elites classes.
Right.
Yeah, even such organizations are not talking about the rural areas LGBT community.
Right.
They are limited into these urban areas only.
Right.
I'll just try to put things in perspectives because the thing which my friend over there, she raised up about the whole blog that was written and the social media thing.
About Pune Pride.
About Pune Pride,
yeah.
So just because we were discussing about spaces and we were discussing about how it was being created, I was just trying to think through it, because like I had friends who were on this side, like posting against what was happening. They were trying to define, like again the definition comes in, like how do we define the LGBTIQ like tribe, as in what do we see ourselves as? So there was this whole cry out of flamboyancy being representation, and on the other side there was this normative, the other, like Samapati Trust, while they were coming in their defense or their counter on it, they were coming in with like they had this normative ways, like why they were doing it. So because there were spaces again, like earlier there was experiences wherein the like public toilets were used for dealing with sex. So their way of seeing in it was this way, that these are not the spaces to do so, and you all are in that way maligning the name of the whole tribe. So everybody was trying to put in their own perspectives of what this community is all about.
Like you're representing us badly if you behave in a flamboyant or
So
basically in a gender non-conforming way also, right?
So as you like said it out earlier, like what do we see it as, like how do we see these spaces being constructed? So I was just kind of linking it to that.
So I was present at one of these queer ally meets, and people were discussing something similar about urban and rural, talking in terms of representation, and the idea was like how media representation should be like of a good queer person, so that there are not violent instances that follow because of those representation. And something very interesting came up. So this one person who was trying to think through things was, and then the conversation moved away towards language and language of queer. How it is like the labels that we know in public knowledge are inherently English. So what about the rural speaking, like rural spaces and non-English speaking people? How do they realize these identities and they know about it?
Yeah.
So what stood out was that this constant reference of rural was again in our imagination, was that of like this. And the example that the person gives was that what about a place where like the mother father are farmers and they are illiterate, and then there is this son of theirs who is not fitting in. So the entire, again in ours, so this conversation is taking place in an urban setting, English speaking crowd, and mind the entire conversation is also happening in English. And you are trying to visualize a rural space and a rural setting, and what we are doing is just that we are stereotyping in what we think is rural and which is like inherently not modern yet. So all of it gets linked up. So again, even within community, we can say there is this imagination where we still see rural and urban as different and queer inherently of an urban space.
Yeah, I would like to exemplify her comment. Actually, I am reminded of a movie in Pakistan, but that movie was banned due to some overt sexual overtones. That movie was directed by Saad Khan. There is a YouTube, and
what is the movie called?
I don't know the name of the movie, but the movie is directed by Saad Khan. Okay, so there is a transgender community. Okay,
What's
and
it, Prerna?
Bol.
Thank you.
Bol. Yeah. So there is a transgender community, and there are some upper transgender women, upper hijra women, and there is even within their community, they started colonizing other, marginalized, lower hijra or lower transgender women. So see, again, so many things will come here also, like post-colonial discourse will come, how it operates. It's so all those things. These are nothing but the underpinnings of Western discourses that we can't escape. This is the conundrum, as we can see. This is the space. We can say this is the space. there are so many things. I try to conclude it. There is a assimilation as well as resistance. They want to assimilate the Western discourses, but within this garb of assimilation, they want to resist through their local language by assimilating, by oppositional politics or coalitional politics or some queer politics. Now, whenever we discuss on queer theory or queer studies, there are so many misconceptions around this term queer. Okay, so what I feel about this word is queer. Literally, it means literal. Literally it means awkward, odd.
Weird.
But
Strange.
it's
Ajib.
queer, strange. It's something which does not fit in with the available socially accepted position.
Right.
But if we look at this term from queer perspective, then it is something which challenges the normal, which we consider the normal. It challenges, and queer studies also does not always nothing. It has nothing to do with sexuality always. Okay, so this is the thing also we can think about. Like she was talking about language. The language that we use, queer or be it queer, Q, L, G, B, T, or any other words, so homosexual. So these are again, I would like to iterate my past comment that it's again Western naming of seemingly new sexual codifications. This is the thing, what I feel.
So I'm going to be very naughty and ask you all to answer your own question, right? So, yeah, it's Western, it's urban, it's elite. How would you counter that? Would you want to counter that? Why would you want to counter that? Right?
I don't think we need to counter that. Let the other discourse be emergent.
No, of course. I mean, let it be is one thing, but if you wanted to make an argument, not even counter to it, but how would you address that discourse? One way is to say, and I'm saying this because I don't want you to do this. One, as in our conversation. I mean, when you're in life, do whatever you want. But be it like I want to just say, one way to counter it is to say, no, it's not Western. It's our thing. Look at the history of all of the queer people in South Asia. We're super gay. All of these relationships have happened since ancient times. This is part of our soil. This is part of the dharti of our place. It's gay. The other thing we could do is say it's not just urban, because look at all the queer sex happening in rural parts of South Asia, right? Now, why am I suggesting that that's not the only way to address this? Because does it disrupt any paradigm to do that? Does it disrupt any notion of, for example, if you're saying it's urban, I will say it's rural, and I will give you examples from the rural. That doesn't disrupt the notion of the urban and rural as being two separate zones, right? We're still participating in that. If we say that it is of our place, if we say this is Indian, for example, we are not disrupting a normative nationalist paradigm around sexual orientation, are we? We're just trying to include ourselves in it, right? And sometimes that may be necessary. Sometimes the audience that you're speaking to, that may be the only thing they understand. That no, this is also part of our history. But we are not limited to that as scholars, right? We're not limited to the paradigm that's given to us. It's your job as scholars to think about the paradigm and the discursive relations in which these kinds of statements are made. So what's another way to deal with this? I've kind of given you the part of the answer. One of them is to make the paradigm itself visible, right? But I'm looking for something. What is another way to deal with this?
Maybe in the first class, we spoke about dissolving categories. And trying to locate.
We talked about dissolving objects.
Objects.
Different than dissolving categories.
No, sorry.
Dissolving the stable object of knowledge.
So basically, if we try to locate who are we talking about when we talk about these statements of rural, the movement is rural, is urban as opposed to rural. If we try to center the who in our discussion, then we can approach it from a different angle instead of, of course, spaces are important, but they also bleed into each other, so we should try to center the who.
Mm-hmm. Okay, center the who. I like that. We appeal to specificity. Poonam.
Going by the spirit of what we were discussing yesterday, if we try to think historically about how sexuality has been controlled in, not separating the pre-colonial, like understanding it from the pre-colonial times. I was thinking caste and understanding how sexuality operated that way, and through the colonial time. Like one of the articles we read for today was about how sodomy was created in the colonial period.
As a type. Right?
So if we try to understand how that has happened historically, to see how in the present it manifests as an interaction of space and sexuality.
Okay. So yours is an appeal to history. Yours is an appeal to specificity.
This may be a liberal humanist kind of thing to say, but I like to make things fuzzy. I think maybe talking about homosociality and anxiety around it may be one way. That there are spaces that are very, very homosocial.
Can you speak louder, please?
That there are spaces that are homosocial, that are there in our world, regardless of where they're located in terms of rural, urban, institutions, across institutions. And to me, that's a useful way, because I think people have this tendency that you were pointing out earlier to other, and to not think of solidarity as another tactic. So surely there is, if there are homosocial bonds and spaces, that's another way to question, I guess, anxieties about what people do and where they're located and who they are. It's all of us, right? Because we're all in some ways homosocial, right? We have intense maybe relationships with people that we think are like us. Where do they happen, right? So there are, even if it's, so I'm interested in the heterosexual lobby. I guess that was clear. So, even if it's women behind the house talking about, can you give me a cup of sugar? Oh, my husband's just come home. Can you help me? Do you have some atta? I mean, that's a homosocial space. And we have those. And so why are you segregating that from practices that may extend further, or even just that? I mean, that's useful too to me.
Neha.
I don't know if this makes any sense at all, but sometimes to maybe just ask the question, if yes, so what? In the sense that, yes, maybe homosexuality is a Western category. Maybe it came to us from a certain history.
Right.
Does it help us to make sense of something in our world around us today?
Yes.
And if it does that, then why should its origin be the problem? So, I mean, in a sense, just ask the question, maybe what you're saying is right. Does that therefore make it invalid?
Right.
And if not, I mean, and are there parts of it which are maybe invalid, but are there parts of it which still help us to make sense of the world around us, where we are as we are, despite where it has come from? I mean, I don't know if that's...
No, I'm reacting because I totally agree with you, and there is a kind of a, I won't even call it only a body of work, but a kind of an ethos, I would say, that you could categorize as a kind of interest in decolonial theories of gender and sexuality, which part of which would say, yeah, it makes it invalid. Right? It does make it invalid. So even with your appeal to homosociality, I think all of these strategies of addressing this discourse are effective, right? That it depends on your audience and the kind of argument that you're trying to make. And there is a counter to it also, always. One thing that I would say collectively we may want to think about is whether we are still thinking about, in this case we're talking mainly about sexual orientation, so I'll limit myself to that. Are we thinking about sexual orientation still in a kind of liberal individualist mode? Right? All of these strategies, part of what they are, part of the appeal is still to the right to the individual to say who they are and do what they want. And that's not wrong, right? People should have the right to say who they are and do what they want, as long as it doesn't violate certain basic rules of social comportment. Like don't be violent, don't steal stuff, the kind of things that make a society livable. What I would suggest, and because as I started the session by saying I'm interested in this sort of materialist, not necessarily liberal individualist way of thinking about sexuality. And when I say that, is it clear to you what the concern is around that? The concern around thinking about sexuality as a purely individual aspect of the self is that we are not able to consider other kind of more social or political ways of being in the world. So here's one example. In the case of sex work, right? In the case of sex work, where I did my work in Bombay, one of the things that I was pushing against was this relatively new, at that time, because I started that project in the late 90s, at that time, the relatively new radical feminist anti-trafficking discourse. And the radical feminist anti-trafficking discourse said, if a woman in India is doing sex work, it's because she has been forced to do it. So in that paradigm, the only response you could give is to say, well, no, she's not forced. She's choosing to do it, right? Force and choice are still happening within a liberal individualist mode. That's still, I'm an individual, I'm either forced or I choose. Now, what I countered that with was not, so I didn't go to Bombay and find all these people full of choice, right? I found a bunch of poor Dalit women who were making a living. And when they could feed their stomach and the stomach of their family, they were content, they were happy. And when they couldn't, they were upset. The source of their tension was around having to survive poverty. Right? So that aspect of the everyday life of doing sex work in India, that people are trying to mitigate poverty, is not assimilable within a forced choice paradigm, because that is a liberal individualist paradigm. And that paradigm comes from a history of trying to separate the economic from other aspects of social life. Right? That's Marxist, that's backward, that's unreconstructed socialism. What would happen if we thought about sex work in economic terms? As people are trying to mitigate poverty, they're trying to mitigate violence. What if we thought about it in capitalist terms? And to that extent, I will just show you this article by Jairas Banerjee called "Fictions of Free Labor," in which he says the issue with respect to the idea of free labor is not that of the plasticity of legal reasoning, of where one draws the line between free and unfree labor, but of the incoherence of the concept of free labor under capitalism. No one has a purely free choice when everyone has to make a living. Which is not to say that doing sex work is the same as being a college professor, right? It's not equivalent. There are stratas, there are different statuses of people, but everyone under capitalism is to some degree alienated from their labor. That's the point of it. So if we think about sex work in terms of livelihood, we are suddenly stepping back from this liberal individualist paradigm, which is kind of making an ethical universe in which here are these women, bad things are done to them, they are good people, bad things are done to them by these bad men, so we have to rescue them out of sex work. And then people are shocked when women are trying to escape from the remand home to go back to the brothel to work because they're not making money in the remand home, right? No matter how horrible their situation might be or might not be in the brothel, maybe they're living with their families and doing sex work. That's also an observable phenomenon. The whole question of livelihood does not come in that kind of forced choice paradigm. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we have our session ostensibly on caste and sexuality, but at this point we're talking about everything all the time. With respect to this question of the urban and the rural, and I'm sorry, we have like 10 more minutes and then I ran out of time. And I actually think, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but that example you gave from where your village and your relatives, I think is very, very interesting and very helpful. Because the thing about rural life is that it is very difficult to be an economically autonomous person in any rural place. You know, when you're living in a network of people, the property is shared, the resources are shared. In a sense, you know, if I think about what enables urban elite people to identify themselves as queer and to live a so-called queer life, you know, which might mean hanging around with their queer friends, making a home that's a community for their friends, having a partner, living with a partner. These are also intensely material phenomena, right? You have to be an economically autonomous individual in order to make a decision about how to live that's different from that which is expected of you, right? So rather than say, well, the rural is backward and the urban is modern, we might say, in an urban environment, we have access to some people who have a certain kind of class and caste privilege have access to economic autonomy. And that economic autonomy facilitates participation in all kinds of other structures of everyday life, including those of sexuality. Essentially, you have to have your own space. You have to have your own home. You have to be able to earn a living yourself. I mean, one thing that I heard myself say in a meeting in Bombay not that long ago was, how many of us, when we realized that we were not heterosexual, how many of us did not initially think, what's going to happen to me physically, materially, because of this? What am I sacrificing if I understand myself to be queer and having to live a queer life? Will I get thrown out of my house? That's usually the first thing people think if they're young, right? Where will I live? Such a material concern, right? The U.S. has a huge problem of homeless queer and transgender youth. And it's not being addressed because sexual orientation and gender identity are not being seen as economic concerns. They're being seen as concerns that adhere to things like health and the body and the society, the kind of ethics of LGBTQ life, right? So you have gay marriage, you have the recognition of transgender people on driver's licenses. You don't have a social safety net for people who remove themselves from their natal family, which is also the place that they're sustained. What about sustenance with respect to these questions, right? What about the political economy of sexual orientation and gender identity? It has one, right? It's not just an ethical universe. It's not an individual universe. It's not an expressive universe in which these things happen. It's also an economic universe in which they happen. That's another way to push back on this. in addition to some of the other wonderful things that you all said about, including the fact that the urban and the rural are very much connected, always, economically, among other reasons. Okay. Do you need some time for this? Please.
About this urban-rural, because sometimes if we go back to which you started about discursive and discourse.
Yes.
Do we see it as it is not subverting the politics of whether it is women's movement politics or queer movement politics, but it is a question of continuously getting challenged about the legitimacy which movement or scholars want to claim on the issue.
Sure.
It's not something which is urban versus rural. Those who also talk about that why LGBTQ or women's movement is urban, they are not, in that sense, not unaware of that there is a continuity between urban and rural, or there are those who can speak on behalf of rural. We can also then challenge them that are they elite from the rural who can talk. So instead of going into that, if we see it in terms of whether it is subverting the politics of going in that sense progressive politics, or is it continuously questioning the legitimacy with which we argue out our case? Because sometimes then we generally only talk about the whether it is only challenging, but it is also continuously challenging the legitimacy of those who want to claim the voice, who want to claim the representative voice. So you are getting continuously challenged to produce alternative discourse in the movement.
I think that's very helpful in terms of identifying the power behind some of these accusations. Right? The challenge is coming from a nativist, conservative, status quo focused perspective. Right? These are not benign questions. To say that homosexuality is not Indian or is not South Asian is not coming from people who are interested in, the proliferation of different forms of social life in South Asia. It's coming from those who are trying to control it, in a sense, to keep it narrow, to keep it. And, again, there's a big irony in that, right? Because, there is no place in the world that does not have sexual and gender-based diversity, right? Everybody is doing everything all the time, and it's crazy, and they've been doing everything all the time forever. But what it gets called, how it gets interpolated into structures of governance, how it gets recognized and assigned something juridically and through other discourses, those things change over time. And what people do changes too. I don't mean to say everyone's been doing the same thing forever, but it's not easy to draw a line around, this is what happens in this place. What's interesting about the appeal to some kind of normative notion of nationally based practice, this is what we do, this is what we do not do, is also the result of a long period of colonialist discourse about what is and is not of that place. Right? So in a sense, actually what's Western, if you want to call it that, about this discourse is the claim that these things are not Western. If you see what I mean. Right? The whole obsession with what's Western, what's not Western, what's from here, what's not from here. Not that people in South Asia did not have a concern with what was local and what was not local. Sudito Kaviraj and others have written about the kind of circles within circles that historically allowed people to manage all of the traffic that was going on in the places that he's talking about, at least. But, the specifically nationalist form that this nativism takes is necessarily also has a European referent, because nationalism has a European referent, right? So you kind of, just even the fact that we're talking in these terms has to do with a very connected history with other parts of the world, even though it purports not to be. Okay. I think that's as good a place as any to stop. I will pick up here tomorrow. Please come with questions. And tomorrow, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework. Please come ready to summarize what we talked about today. Like if I ask, I'm going to ask you tomorrow, what did we talk about today? Please come prepared with a tight synopsis of what we talked about today. I think that will be helpful for everybody. Thank you.